The argument that comes from the other side of the revivalist is that you cannot call Hazrat Hussain a fringe element. He actually went for a sort of a movement against the ruler of the state. And in the Shiite tradition, later on we saw the movement of Nafs Zakiya and Zaid bin Ali from the same tradition. So how do you look at Imam Hussein's
I'd like to say three things in response to this question. Number one, it's really the fallacy of essentialism, where we think of the Islamic discourse as a monolithic whole. It is not. Right from day one, there have been different varying interpretations. I was referring to the majority opinion, right? For instance, we just heard Moiz talking about the polytheists of Mecca as being the addressees of the verse that you were referring from Surah Tawbah. Now this is an idea which again is accepted by classical exegetes, the Mufassirun, like Bedawi and Ibn Kasir and other people have accepted, Zamakhshari have accepted this idea, but it was not really accepted as such by the jurists. On the other hand, when you talk about the praxis, it was never really implemented. I had the opportunity of questioning Patricia Crone, who's one of the foremost proponents of the idea that Muslims were doing it to justify a divine rule. And I asked, where exactly in Islamic history have Muslims, apart from the Arabian Peninsula itself, actually forced people to convert to Islam just because they were polytheists? The best example would be the Indian subcontinent itself. Muslims came here in around 711 or 712, and they were idolaters here. But the Muslim jurists at that time declared them Shibah al-Kitab, analogous to people of the book. So where exactly did this happen? So number one, there have been different interpretations, and one should develop this ability even in modern times, taking lesson from the tradition of our ancestors, that they had different opinions. I was just referring to the majority opinion. Secondly, when you talk about historical facts and see them in modern times, there's the possibility of plethora of interpretations, right? One interpretation could be that what Hussain did was essentially something that justifies jihad at an individual level. Another example could be that of Abu Basir, for instance, the person who came running from Mecca and went into Medina, and the Prophet returned him, and on his way back he killed the two people, taking him, went to a remote place, hilly area that was called Is, and began sort of a kind of guerrilla warfare there, and ultimately the Quraysh got so sick and tired of him that they pardoned him. And a lot of people say that this is a good example of the legitimacy of this kind of war. Now both these instances, if I may refer to both, because you're talking about historical precedents, it's a case of interpretation. Now in case of Hussain, for instance, there are a lot of people who have suggested that his idea of going to Kufa and having the legal authority of the collectivity itself is ample proof of the fact that he was not, why didn't he start the insurgency right in Medina or Mecca itself? I mean, why did he have to go there and form an independent collectivity, form an independent state, if you like, if I might use that term, and then do it? And then we have reports in within the Shiite corpus of history, which point out that, and I'm quoting, referring to Shiite sources here, which point out three conditions that he spelled out: that either you let me go back to Medina, or you let me go to Yazid so that I accept his bay'ah, or that you let me go and fight at the frontier. So again, it's a question of interpretation. When you talk about Abu Basir, again it's a question of interpretation. You find in Fathul Bari, which is one of the most well-known sharahs or explanations of Bukhari itself, and he points out that the Prophet himself rebuked Abu Basir and said that he's going to start a war for us, and he was not very happy with this step. So how does this become the foundation? All these are historical precedents which can be interpreted in so many different ways. I've already alluded to some very strong possibilities of their being interpreted in a different way. The question is, the primary question is if Muslims have a deontological approach towards morality, which is text-based rules that they invoke to decide whether something is Islamic or not, then the foundational argument has to come from the texts themselves. What is that foundational argument? The mainstream classical jurists, the mainstream classical thinkers have always accepted the idea, and there is the vast majority right from day one up to modern times have accepted the idea that there can be no jihad without the collective authority. You might call it state, you might call it al-Jama in the words of the hadith, or you might call it as-Sultan in the words of the hadith, call it what you will. But the idea of collective authority, both for the implementation of hudud, Islamic laws, and for the waging of a war, and number two, the proclamation of that war, and number three, proclamation not in violation of any treaty, is a mainstream Muslim idea.
Well, Moiz, the way he said, it is very difficult to accept that it was a matter of interpretation for Hussein Raziallahu Ta'ala, because he was very much part of the whole, life of the Prophet. For him to interpret things differently was, it's probably difficult to accept.
If I may correct my point, because I think it's not being quoted correctly, what I said was that whatever events happened in those times are being interpreted today by you, by me, and by other people. Right. And just as it is possible for a person to give those events this interpretation, that whatever happened provided legitimacy for jihad without the authority of the state, it is equally possible, in fact I can debate on this, that there is a greater possibility coming out from those events for the purpose of interpretation, that it actually proves the other point. Why did he have to go to Kufa to develop his authority under a collectivity there?
Right, right.